Things we used to do. No.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Kind of a fun lesson today. We're talking about an individual battle, which is cool. I like battles. If I wasn't a pastor, maybe I'd be a military historian or something. That would be really interesting. But I've been into military history my whole life, and I've always been a World War II buff, and not so much a buff of wars in the 16th century, but those directly relate to the whole Protestant-Catholic divide. So this battle is very interesting that involved entirely Catholic forces that had been depleted after fighting numerous wars with Protestants, but they still managed to win a victory against the Ottomans. Sorry I gave that spoiler alert. I should have given a spoiler alert. But let's begin with prayer, and then we actually have, this lesson's kind of long today, and I wanted to share a poem about the Battle of Lepanto by Gilbert K, Chesterton, my favorite writer. And that poem will take me probably about 10 minutes to read. So let's open with prayer, and then we'll get down to business. Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity once again to gather together to study an episode of Christian history. It's fascinating that this battle is so important for European history and for the survival of, well, the Papal States and the other Catholic powers in Europe, and that it led to so much. And while it doesn't affect us as much as Lutherans, it's still a piece of the Church's history. We thank you, God, that we can study this in freedom, and that we have technology so that this can be shared with others. And please keep us open and honest as we study this. In the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen. So to Catholics, the Battle of Lepanto is a much bigger deal because it established the practice of the Rosary. So the Rosary, according to legend, was created by Saint Dominic way back in the when would that have been? When was he alive? Early 13th century. So that's according to legend when it started. And it became a little bit more popular and picked up more and more steam. But during the Battle of Lepanto and immediately afterwards, the practice of praying with the Rosary exploded in popularity, and the Pope established a feast called Our Lady of Victory, and that ended up changing to Our Lady of the Rosary. So every October 7th is still the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary. And as you guys know, conservative Catholics or traditional Catholics will really get into their praying of the Rosary, and it's a huge part of their spirituality. But I started at the end, so let's start at the beginning. Here's a painting. There are so many paintings of the Battle of Lepanto, and most of those paintings are like just masses of men and spears and oars and sails and cannons and waves. And it's very difficult to see anything. But what's very interesting is that the Battle of Lepanto actually was like that. At one point, the Ottoman ships and the Christian ships were so close together that they basically formed one continuous platform, and you could run across the boats. And that's what people were doing, but running across the boats, with guns and knives and swords, killing each other. But all of the boats at this time were galleys, so they had oarsmen, and this is the last battle ever fought between oarsmen, or the last major battle, I should say, ever fought between ships that were mainly crewed by oarsmen. And they were basically mobile artillery platforms or mobile infantry platforms, because the boats had a couple of cannons, but mainly the firepower came from all of the infantry that would be on the decks with crossbows and compound bows, and then arquebuses, which are the precursor to muskets. Basically, the precursor to the flintlock musket was an arquebus, and they looked really cool. They looked like, here, I can kind of draw a picture, kind of, they look kind of like, oop, that's a really bad barrel. But they looked like this, the ramrod was here, and then they actually had a kind of a support like that. And very primitive, gunpowder was put in here, and the ball would be inserted here, and then there was a fuse that was like lit, that was lit, and then when the trigger was pulled, the fuse would ignite the pan of powder. Very primitive weapons, but a lot of the Christians were armed with these, but not a lot of the Ottomans. So the Christians already had kind of an edge. But this battle was, I mean, it was intense, and that ships were just going alongside of each other, and men were just pouring into each other's ships, and it was just a brutal hand-to-hand conflict. And this is one of the only paintings I could find by Antonio Brugada of the 19th century called Battle de Lepanto, Battle of Lepanto, where he kind of gave a little bit of a zoomed out picture, and you can see the Ottoman and you can see the flags of the ships on the masts, and you see how they're just all in a huge just pile in the sea. So yeah, and then you see the oars too, and these are galleys and galleons. So you know, the ship that would have been built and popular in the 16th century, and indeed the ships that were used by Portuguese explorers, but without the oars, right? These had oars, and they were intended for naval combat. Okay, it might seem strange that there are some scriptural starting places, but there are just a couple, because when we're talking about Lepanto and a Catholic coalition and the Rosary, we're talking about basically what is considered a holy war, right? So there's a lot about holy war in the Bible. Deuteronomy 20, verse 1 to 4. Let's start there.
When you go to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army greater than yours, do not be afraid of them, because the Lord your God, who brought you up out of Egypt, will be with you. When you are about to go into battle, the priest shall come forward and address the army. He shall say, Hear, O Israel, today you are going into battle against your enemies. Do not be faint-hearted or afraid. Do not be terrified or give way to panic before them. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you victory.
Now, I don't know if that was read immediately before the battle, but it fits so perfectly. The Christians believed that their navy was sanctioned by God. They believed that they had it was crucial for them to win a victory over the Ottomans, who were godless heretics to them, and the Ottomans were numerically superior to the Christians by about 10,000 people or something like that. And think about how many 10,000 people in boats. I mean, that's a lot of boats and oarsmen and slaves and sailors and infantrymen. What's interesting, though, too, is that before the battle, the priests, just like during the Crusades or other holy wars, the priests basically began the battle by forgiving the sins of the men and by administering communion and bolstering them and giving them pep talks. And then also, it's interesting. So here, when the priest says, Hear, O Israel, you're going for battle, don't let your heart be faint. Right before the battle, the admiral of the Christians, Don John of Austria, said, There's no paradise for cowards. That's his famous line that he said to all of his troops to give them courage and to make sure that they were fighting and stalwart during the battle. Again, I don't know if this was read, but it fits so perfectly with the battle that I bet you that some priests were reading this and thinking about this text on the ships before the battle was fought. Let's go to Psalm 18 next, which is a very long psalm, but we're looking at verse 34 of the psalm and then verse 39.
He trains my hands for battle. My arms can bend a bow of bronze. Then we go to 39.
Mm-hmm.
You armed me and with strength for battle. You made my adversaries bow at my feet.
Okay, so again, throughout the Psalms there are a lot of military passages or verses that involve metaphors taken from warfare. David was a warrior, right? He killed Goliath. I'm teaching. We're reading all kinds of Bible stories to Gwen right now, and when I get to Goliath, it's like the beginner's Bible, right? And so David kills Goliath, and it says in the Bible, I don't know if it's used the word kill, but it says, then Goliath fell down and was dead. I think that's what it says. but then Gwen turns the Bible over, and on the cover of the beginner's Bible is Goliath standing, like smiling, with all these other Bible characters, and then Gwen says, "See, Goliath's here. Goliath's happy." She just kind of goes on, and I'm like, man, how do I explain that? So I say, no, Goliath was a bad guy. He was wicked. Okay, and I want to teach her that, you know, like Jack the Giant Killer or David and Goliath, it's a good thing when the giant bad guys are killed.
And explain he was happy because he knew he was going to beat everybody.
Well, that same idea when you conquered the other guy, their leaders, you know, we have that stain where you put them under your feet.
Yeah.
And so their practice was to make the people they conquered lay down, face down on the dirt, and the king would come and put his foot right here in the back of your neck.
Mm-hmm.
And then he would slightly press down perhaps a little bit to see if you would say, "I surrender and I give you honor and allegiance to you."
Yeah.
You know, so that's the picture.
Yeah. So yeah, there throughout the Psalms, throughout David's writings in the Bible, yeah, there's this language about God give me strength to overcome my adversary and let him bite the dust, right? Let me utterly destroy him and crush him into dust and fine powder, and so without a doubt, I know if you remember the beginning, or no, I don't remember where it is in the movie Patton, but at one point Patton is reading a psalm and is quoting a psalm that's using military language, and you know, even General Patton, who I think famously read the Bible every day, but he saw that the Psalms kind of pertain to him as a warrior, and so these sailors and Christian infantry from the late 1500s, they also understood that David was the warrior, right? And that a lot of this language isn't just metaphorical for Christians overcoming their temptations or their demons, but also literally meant that God would give the Christians victory, military victory over their enemies. So that'd be an interesting Bible study sometime to look at holy war in the Bible, or just war imagery. You know, then Paul with his full armor of God and everything else. But anyways, let's go into background. So background to the Battle of Lepanto. At this time, 1560s, 1570s, Europe has been racked by the wars of religion following the gains of the Protestant Reformation in Germany, France, Holland, Switzerland, and England. So I had to trim this list down. I had to eliminate something like 12 other wars because it just got too long. But I included all the major wars that took place in the Holy Roman Empire, in Germany, the Low Countries, and then Scandinavia. But here are all the wars that happened because of the Reformation, okay? And you notice the first one is the Knights Revolt, which was the precursor to the Peasants' Rebellion and the Peasants' War. And Luther wrote about those extensively and preached on them. Luther was horrified by the Peasants' Revolt and wanted the German princes to just capture and hang all of the peasants, because he thought that some of these people were making war because the Reformation had given them a pretense for making war. So in other words, a lot of peasants realized, oh, Luther says we can read the Bible for ourselves, and that we're equal to priests and equal to our leaders because we're all baptized Christians. Well, you know, we deserve our more property, or we need to have our rights. We need to fight for our rights. And so that's why the Peasants' War began. That's an oversimplification, but
yeah, and they keyed in on that, right? That, you know, statues and other things don't really have any power, and you don't need them, and are better off than not having. So they destroyed lots of the church art.
Oh yeah.
Too.
Yeah, iconoclasm was widespread in several of these wars. So especially in the Low Countries, the Calvinist areas were even more iconoclastic than the Lutheran areas. And famously, when Luther returned to Wittenberg, I think after his stay in the Wartburg, he put a kibosh on the iconoclasm that was happening, because a bunch of his more radical associates were destroying church windows and church art in Wittenberg and burning paintings and beheading statues. And when Luther returned, he said, stop. Art has its place. As long as it's not reverenced as an idol, art can serve as a teaching tool. So art has primarily had a didactic purpose in the Lutheran Church. It's assisted our teaching and everything else.
Yeah, he told them that, this might help this other person in his faith and in his life, and how dare you take that away from them?
Right.
It doesn't matter what you think. It's almost like Paul's discussion with the eating animals sacrificed to idols.
Yeah.
The guy thinks it's terrible and you shouldn't do it, and another guy, doesn't matter, it ain't no idol.
Right, yeah.
So, do the better thing.
And art, I think this goes back to Pope Gregory the Great, maybe, who said that art in church is the book for the illiterate, or the Bible for the illiterate. Doesn't really serve that purpose anymore. Now it's just a way to fill blank walls, I think, in churches, right? I mean, there's, when pastors can, they'll say, oh, we have a depiction of just what I'm talking about, an ancient Trinitarian symbol on that window over there on the east wall or something. So, pastors or I will occasionally do that, but it's not like the Middle Ages. It's not like being in Notre Dame or Chartres or, Cologne or one of these magnificent cathedrals that has just so much stained glass in it and that illustrates the whole narrative of salvation. But yeah, indeed. Yes, Sonia.
The nice thing, though, if you have a church with stained glass windows that have the different Bible stories in there, it can be a good thing for children. They're not going to be paying attention necessarily to the whole sermon, but they can look at that picture and think, oh yeah, that's about this, and remember a Bible story they've been told, or they can ask, well, what's this about? So it's that can be a real blessing, and just even us seeing it reminds us too, even though we can read all of them.
Yeah, definitely. But in the early part of the 16th century, there were just huge groups of Protestants that thought, well, that may be true, but it's not worth the temptation to break the first commandment, and worship other gods before God. Worship these idols of saints and other heroes of the faith. So let's just destroy them. But let me go through this list of wars. Knights Revolt, 1522 to 23. In the Holy Roman Empire, throughout the Holy Roman Empire. The German Peasants' War, 1524 to 26 in the Holy Roman Empire. The Wars of Kappel, 1529 to 1531. Those were the big wars that took place in Switzerland, where Zwingli died during that. The War of the Two Kings in the Kalmar Union, that would be Denmark and Norway in the 1530s. The Counts' Feud, which also took place in the 1530s in Denmark and Norway. The Minster Rebellion, 1534 to 35 in the Prince Bishopric of Münster. That's when Münster cheese was invented. No. The bishop held up a piece of cheese as a shield, and it got shot full of holes, and I don't know. The Anabaptist riot in Amsterdam. So as you can imagine, an Anabaptist riot led to a lot of broken images and burned churches. The Daca War in Sweden, the Schmalkaldic War, which is a big one, so 46 to 47, which we talked about last time, I believe, that involved many Lutheran princes. And then the Second Schmalkaldic War, which is also called the Princes' Revolt, 1552 to 1555. That was involving Duke Moritz of Saxony and numerous other important Lutheran princes. That interrupted the Council of Trent. The French Wars of Religion, which were very bloody and lasted for some 36 years in France in the 1560s to the 1590s. The 80 Years' War, which I actually had never heard of, in the Low Countries, 1566-68 to 1648. It wasn't an 80-year-long non-stop war, but it was a series of conflicts in the Low Countries, in Holland and Belgium, involving iconoclastic Protestants and Catholics, and then other various Protestant groups, and led to a lot of destroyed art once again. Finally, in 1555, we have the Peace of Augsburg, which established the general rule Quis regio eius religio, which I'm not good at pronouncing, but basically it's Latin for whose rule, whose religion. So whoever is the ruler, his religion determines the religion that is going to be the established religion. So if you have a Lutheran prince, Lutheranism will be the established religion in that area. If you have a Catholic prince, Catholicism will be the established religion. You may still be allowed to be Lutheran in that area, but you won't have all of the rights and privileges that you would if your ruler was Lutheran.
It's amazing, you know, they go on for 100 years plus.
Yeah.
And all these battles from all over the place, my goodness.
Yeah, it is, it's kind of shocking. It was really shocking. Yeah, Sonny?
Okay, with the whose rule, whose religion, you know, you've got all these different provinces in Germany and that, and there are different ones, like I know Bavaria is very Catholic and that, although my husband has ancestors that came from there that were all Lutheran and that. So I'm just wondering, was it like, you know, some other elector or prince, whatever, comes in charge and he decides, no, he doesn't want to be Roman Catholic, he wants to be Lutheran, then is everybody Lutheran and no priests can serve there? Is that how it was at that time?
I don't think that kind of dramatic shift really happened, maybe more than a couple of times, but generally speaking, if a province like Bavaria or the Rhineland was Catholic, the royal houses that ruled those areas would be dyed-in-the-wool Catholic, and probably there was an occasional outlier where this Catholic son just decided to become Lutheran or something, but to change the entire religion of the province then, or to change the religious sensibilities of the province would have been incredibly difficult. So I'm guessing in those instances, you know, the family maybe quietly removed that ruler or something else happened, but that dramatic shift was almost impossible, right?
Yeah,
to just kind of
so.
flip from one to the other. So generally speaking, Catholics were in the Rhineland and Bavaria, southern Germany. Lutherans were in northern Germany, around Wittenberg, Berlin, Prussia, Mecklenburg, Vorpommern, which is where my ancestors come from. And then Calvinists were active in Switzerland and the Low Countries, and then eastern France. And then France was obviously Catholic, in Italy. Northern Italy, though, still had some Protestants dating way back to the 1400s. And then to the Waldensians, right, dating back to Peter Waldo. So before that, 1200s. And then you have Hussites in Bohemia still. And then, of course, England and Scotland was very Protestant at this time. Ireland was Catholic and kind of remains Catholic, although Ireland is really denouncing its Catholicism now and hating its Catholicism because of all the priest abuse scandals. It's really hard to see.
So did they have lots of people moving back and forth in that region? Because now I can't practice my religion here, I'm going over there. And...
Yes, yeah, you have a lot of migration, and kind of you also have migrating into cities at this time from the countryside. So this is, again, part of the late medieval growth of cities. And then also this is eventually going to lead to the 30 Years' War in 1618, which is basically the 60 Years' War, the 30 Years' War is World War I, because it involved, you know, all peoples in Europe, just as World War I in 1914 did, but the 30 Years' War was even more destructive. It was the most destructive conflict to date, right, in European history. And that saw mass migration of people because whole Lutheran areas would be just burned and decimated, and the populations would be lowered to almost nothing. And then Catholics would move in, or vice versa. So we're actually not going to have a lesson on the 30 Years' War, but we probably should. But I don't know if we have enough time. Next week I'm going to focus on Galileo and the conflict between reason and religion. Anyways, 1555, the Peace of Augsburg. I learned about that in high school, actually. I remember talking about whose rule, whose religion. That's kind of the main thrust of all of these wars in the 16th century. And then next bullet point I already covered, about who lived where, or what was Catholic, what was Protestant. So meanwhile, while all this is going on in Europe, the Ottoman Turks, so the Muslim Ottoman Turks, are winning battles and extending their power. Sultan Selim I, who ruled, that's not supposed to say 1512 to 1512, 1512 to 1520, defeated the Shah of Iran in the Battle of Calderon in 1514, and then took control of Egypt. So it's interesting that, you know, during Luther's discovery of the gospel and his posting of the 95 Theses, this Sultan of the Ottoman Turks took control of Egypt and then spread his forces east into Iran and defeated the Persians, the Shah of Iran, And again, it's just an example of the Ottomans spreading their power. And again, the Ottomans, medieval Muslim history is very complicated. But you have different sultanates, right, and different shahs, and they weren't always friendly with each other. So during the Crusades, the Crusaders would have been wise to equip or serve with other factions in the Islamic kingdom, because sometimes the different shahs or sultans hated each other more than they hated any Christian. But at this time, the Ottomans took control. I think we talked about this. They came from, I think, Armenia, Eastern Turkey, and then they just spread and spread and spread and got bigger and bigger. And then the big victory for them was taking Constantinople in 1453. And that's how the Ottoman Turks established themselves as the biggest power base within Islam.
Now, because of all that battling going on up in Europe and everything, it distracted the people and it gave them, hey, this is our time, let's go do it.
Yeah.
You know, and they really conquered a lot of stuff.
Oh.
They probably wouldn't have, because those other countries would have said, hey, come down and help us. And they didn't have any help.
Yeah, it's true. And yeah, you're right. It's particularly with Cyprus and Tunis. Those are two areas that, if the Christians wouldn't have been fighting with themselves, they had sent troops and they're trying to save those places from the Muslims. But Cyprus fell, they recaptured Tunis, and then they eventually lost it after a few years only. So there are a lot of examples of kind of limited victory against the Ottomans that then were spoiled because the Christians couldn't form an effective alliance with each other, with one another. Maybe you've heard of Suleiman the Magnificent. I can't think of many other people who have the Magnificent, added onto their name. So that's a pretty big deal, pretty big accomplishment. He reigned from 1520 to 1566, so he had a long reign. Suleiman is the one who built up Jerusalem too, and if you go to Jerusalem, the walls you can see to this day, the famous walls around the Dome of the Rock and around the whole city, those were constructed by Suleiman. And he was augmenting the walls built by earlier Muslims and also by Crusaders going back to Bible times. But Suleiman decisively defeats the Hungarians in the Battle of Mohacs in 1526. That's a very crucial and important battle that's been studied at length. And with that battle, he takes control of all of Hungary. So he's within striking distance of Vienna, right? Within striking distance of Bohemia, eventually, southern Germany, Bavaria. And then he takes time to extend influence in the Balkans and Transylvania and even the Caucasus. So the Ottomans under Suleiman reach an enormous, their territory reaches an enormous size, and they have incredible power at this point.
So when we say the Ottomans, that's basically the Muslim group that's invading Europe?
Yeah, just like if we right now were Muslims and we were talking about the Holy Roman Empire, you'd probably ask a similar question, like, so is the Holy Roman Empire the Christian group? And I mean, the answer is yes, but it's much more complicated than that, because there are all these other, shahs and rulers, and that's a part of history that I'm not super clear on, to be honest. But various Muslim households, just like in European history, right? Various households or various dynasties established themselves and ended up ruling. Charles V ended up being the Holy Roman Empire and being immensely powerful over all of Europe in at the beginning of the Reformation. Before that, and now at this exact same period of time, but in the East, it's Suleiman the Magnificent who's exerting Ottoman influence in Iran, Iraq, North Africa, the Balkans, the Caucasus, modern day Georgia and Russia. So he just builds up the Ottoman Turks to an incredible amount of power and land. In 1538, there is an abortive alliance formed by Pope Paul III of Venetians and Spanish troops and some Knights of Malta and Hospitallers, and they form a navy to try and fight the Ottomans, but they lose at they suffer a huge defeat at Preveza in the Aegean Sea. And then in 1570 to 1571, the Ottomans capture Cyprus, which was incredibly significant. Cyprus, I think it was a later admiral or sultan said Cyprus was like an arm of the Christians. And to sever that arm, you lose control of the Eastern Mediterranean. Cyprus is, Cyprus with its excellent harbors and excellent fortifications was a stronghold against the Ottomans. But after a huge siege that lasted a long time, the Ottomans took control of Cyprus from the Venetians. They flay the Venetian general, so they flay him, behead all of his captains, and then hang their heads and their bodies, their skin, from their warships. As you can imagine, that really angered some European, angered the Venetians, and it was kind of like, we have Remember the Alamo. It's kind of like Remember Cyprus for the Christians at this time because it was such a terrible defeat. Although the Ottomans lost like tens of thousands of people during the siege too. It was a horrible, horrible siege. All right, so Remember Cyprus leads us to 1570, which is kind of marks the beginning for the Battle of Lepanto, or the beginning of preparations for the Battle of Lepanto. In 1570, Pope Pius V, he ruled as Pope from 1566 to 1572. He organized the Holy League, not the Ivy League, but the Holy League, to relieve the Venetians besieged on Malta. The main forces in the Holy League, I'm sorry, that's supposed to say Cyprus. So he formed the Holy League to relieve Venetians that were besieged on Cyprus. So that's a little typo there you can correct. What they didn't know is that Cyprus fell, I think, on August 1st, 1571. So when they organized the Holy League and set sail, Cyprus had already fallen. But this was before telephones and the internet, so they didn't yet know. The main forces in the Holy League were the Venetians and Spanish, who were also the chief financiers of the navy. Others included the Papal States, the Republic of Genoa, the Duchies of Savoy, Urbino, and Tuscany. So Tuscany would be like Pisa, the Pisans. And then also the Knights Hospitaller, which were a medieval religious crusading order, originally established to keep hospitals in Jerusalem, in the Holy Land. But then they became just kind of like a fighting force, a specialist fighting force. Duke John of Austria, the illegitimate son of Charles V, is named admiral and leader of the coalition. And the Christian fleet sailed east from Messina, Italy, making for the Gulf of Corinth. And from the Gulf of Corinth in Greece, then they were going to re-equip their ships, and I'm guessing sail down to Cyprus to attempt to defeat the Ottomans in a pitched naval battle, and then relieve the Venetian defenders of the island. But that didn't happen because it just so happened on October 7th, guess who's sailing from the Gulf, from Corinth? They're sailing from Greece and heading toward Italy. It's the Ottomans. The Ottomans were commanded by Ali Pasha, and they met in the Gulf of Patras, Greece. So I can't draw a great map of Greece, but let's just, oh my goodness, I can't draw a great map at all. But, okay, let's say this is, okay, Italy is over here, okay? This is like right here, okay? Corinth, I think, is about here. And then the Aegean Sea with all the islands. So Messina is over here, and the Christians sail from Messina, and then the Ottomans are sailing this way, and they meet right here in the Gulf of Patras, outside of a city that the Venetians called Lepanto, but everybody else called it something else. I don't remember what the other name is for it, but it's just kind of it's a port town, port city in the Gulf of Patras called Lepanto. So what's interesting is that the fleets were not expecting to meet there, and the Ottomans didn't necessarily want to fight a big naval battle. They were making their way to Italy, but the Christians were making their way to Cyprus, and they happened to meet each other. And then at the same moment, basically, both admirals decided, well, they're here. We should fight them. We should fight them now. We have the equipment. We have the resources right now to fight them. This was the largest naval battle since antiquity. Over 400 warships were involved. And you think each warship has between a dozen and hundreds of guys on it. So over 400 warships were involved. This was also the last naval battle to be fought almost entirely between rowing vessels. The Christians had around 40,000 oarsmen and sailors. Some of those oarsmen were slaves, basically, captured Ottomans. but many of them were free men who got paid. So they're kind of the I was gonna make a joke, but it's not funny. So is it the Bowflex? That's like you buy it and it's like a workout machine and you're rowing. So I'm guessing if you were free oarsmen, you were just so buff and strong from doing that all day long. And many of the oarsmen on the Christian side were armed with weapons. Almost none of the oarsmen on the Ottoman side were armed. They were all weaponless, and they were captured Christians.
So the king sent this message down to his ship. And they were sailing along with their oarsmen and stuff. And the guy tells his oarsman, he says, we'll have some good news and some bad news. Well, we've been rowing so hard. How about the good news first? Oh, the king has declared a holiday. Everybody's cheering, yay! What's the bad news? He wants to go water skiing.
Very funny. All right, so Christians have around 40,000 oarsmen and professional sailors, and then around 20,000 infantry. The Christians, as I mentioned, were mainly armed with arquebuses, the arquebuses, however that's pronounced, which is the precursor to the flintlock musket. The Ottomans had around 37,000 oarsmen, mostly slaves from all over the place. North Africa, modern-day Turkey, the shredded remains of the Byzantine Empire, all these Christian slaves from all around the Mediterranean. 13,000 sailors and 34,000 infantry. Many of the Ottomans were not armed with arquebuses, they were armed with compound bows and crossbows. So that was maybe a bad idea. They should have had more guns. The Christians also had about double the amount of cannons and arquebuses than the Ottomans. So the Ottomans didn't have a lot of ammunition for their cannons, and they didn't have many cannons. They had some ships with cannons, but some ships with no cannons. The Christians generally had arquebuses and cannons on every ship, and they were ready to engage at a longer range than the Ottomans.
Well, if they're slaves, you're not going to arm them.
Yeah, if you're slaves, you're not going to arm them if they're Christian slaves. In the Gulf of Patras, both fleets make the decision to engage. The Christians formed into 4 divisions. And then there's a reserve division over here. So on the left, there are 53 ships under the Venetian commander Barbarigo. Center, you have 62 galleys. That's the biggest division under John of Austria and his flagship, the Real. And then on the right flank, you have 53 galleys led by the Genoese commander Doria. And on this right flank, there were many Knights of Malta and Knights Hospitaller. This was primarily Venetian, this was primarily Spanish, and then this was kind of like a conglomeration. And then in the reserve, you have about 53 galleys. I'm sorry, in the reserve, you have a bunch of galleys led by a Spanish commander, de Bazan. I don't have a number, I don't remember how many galleys he had. You could do the math. He had, a few dozen galleys in reserve. And actually, it's these galleys in reserve that ended up probably winning the battle for the Christians. Just before the engagement, communion was administered, and right before the first shots were fired, the wind shifted in favor of the Christians. So the wind was blowing at the Christians, and right before they engaged with the Ottomans in their naval vessels, by the way, the coast is right here, you have the wind shifting in favor of the Christians. So that's a good sign, right? The left division, which was close to the coast, engaged with the Ottomans first, and Barbarigo and the Ottoman commander Sirocco ended up both being killed. What's interesting here is that as the Ottomans closed in, the Venetians up here went close to the coast because they thought that they would not be able to be encircled by the Ottomans, but the Ottomans ended up sending smaller boats close to the coast and kind of partially encircled. But what ended up happening is that the Venetian galleys were very well armed, and they ended up winning that engagement on the northern flank. And this is where you have what I said, when all the boats were right next to each other, they almost made a continuous platform, and like a boardwalk. And I mean, I can't even imagine what that would have been like to have all of these boats, mixed Ottoman and Christian, all next to each other, all colliding with each other, and people just racing across the decks trying to kill each other. And it was during this during this early part of the engagement that the Christians also started administering weapons to the Christian galley slaves on the Ottoman ships. And so you have these armed slaves who want revenge against their captors, the Muslim Turks. And then those Christian slaves end up rising up and tipping the victory in favor of the Christians. Although both commanders, the commander of the Christians and the commander of the Ottoman Turks, were both killed during this engagement. In the center, you have the flagships meet. So Ali Pasha, the admiral of the Ottomans, is on his flagship, right? And then Don John of Austria is on his flagship, the Real. And those flagships actually meet, and I think they collide. So Ali Pasha's flagship collides with the Real. It sounds like something in a movie, you know? And both admirals are staring down at each other. And there's hand-to-hand combat between the flagships. Meanwhile, all their other boats are shooting at each other, and the Christians have an edge because they have more cannons and more arquebuses. And John, second in command, observes that the Real has been struck by Ali Pasha, and he turns his ship and then runs it right alongside Ali Pasha's ship, and then his men board Ali Pasha's ship, and then they kill Ali Pasha and take control of his boat. So, crazy, and they kill everyone on board. And then the right wing, it's funny, the right wing, whoops, they sail past the Ottomans, and that's where the reserve forces under de Bazan, the Spaniard, come to the rescue to beat back this southern flank of the Ottomans. And these guys that sail past, they have to live with their cowardice and their mistake the rest of their lives. But I think not all of them slip past, but a significant number, and then the rest of these guys kind of get badly beaten by the Ottomans, and that's why the reserves come in, and then they save the day. At the end of the battle, the Christians had taken 117 galleys and 20 galleots. Those were little galleys. Or no, those were big galleys, I'm sorry. And sunk or destroyed some 50 other ships. Around 10,000 Turks were taken prisoner, and many thousands of Christian slaves were rescued. The Christian side suffered about 7,500 deaths. The Turkish side, about 30,000 deaths. So significant difference, right? And just a couple of years later, the Holy League, after this battle, the Holy League does not disband. The Holy League wants to continue and defeat the Ottomans and maybe retake Cyprus or whatever. But because of all these rivalries and wranglings and arguments, the Holy League disbands. Pope Pius V dies shortly after this battle in 1572. And the Holy League is no more. But this was an incredibly significant battle. The Christians truly believed that this battle saved Europe because they thought rightly that the Ottomans would make their way to Italy and then eventually conquer Rome, conquer the Vatican, take out the Pope, right? And then make the Papal States and the Italian city-states and the maritime states like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa part of the Ottoman Empire, and that didn't happen. And then they also feared that if the Ottomans should break through and conquer Italy, then they would go through to Gibraltar and take Portugal and North Africa, and then the age of European expansion and exploration would have also been brought to an end because the Ottomans would have subdued the Europeans in the Atlantic Ocean as well. And then, I already mentioned this, but Pope Pius V famously, when they were about to engage, when this fleet was sailing and they had a good feeling that they would encounter the Ottomans, Pope Pius V announces to all of Europe that every Christian should pray the rosary fervently and pray the rosary and ask, our Mother Mary to intercede for us and to grant our sailors victory. And there is this huge victory, this huge upset, even though the Christians were outnumbered. And that popularized the rosary for all of Europe and now for all of Catholicism. And that feast day on October 7th, the day of the battle, is called Our Lady of Victory because Mary had given the Christians the victory. But now it's called Our Lady of the Rosary, and it's still celebrated.
That change in wind direction reminds me of the Spanish Armada And how the storm came up and basically defeated the Spanish ships and allowed England to.
Popular man, Alan.
Yes.
It is reminiscent. It is reminiscent of that, but just a fascinating pitched battle, and this and who was present but Miguel de Cervantes, the Spanish author and writer of Don Quixote. He was present at this battle, and several other notable authors, leaders, dignitaries were present. But probably the two most interesting moments would be this crazy battle on the left flank, and then this showdown between the two ships. This was kind of a messed up situation with the reserve and with them sailing past. And what the leader there, what was his name? Doria, he was Genoese. He was saying he was trying to sail back so that he would not be outflanked by them, because he thought that they would be, outflanking him. So he just wanted to sail back and get on their rear end, but didn't really work. Interesting victory. On the one hand, you could almost say this has no significance, because shortly after this, the Ottomans rebuilt their navy and had a more powerful navy than ever before, and ended up continuing their conquest in the Balkans and marching the way to Vienna. On the other hand, you could say this is of inestimable consequence, because the Ottomans could have ended the age of exploration, could have ended the papacy, or could have taken control of Italy. And if that would have happened, world history would be so dramatically different. If Muslims controlled Italy, for a period of time, so we don't know what that would have really done. The Lutherans were not involved in this battle, so there were probably maybe a couple Lutherans. I don't know.
There's the movie. I'm not sure how you say the title. It's kind of spelled Les Miserables.
Oh yeah, Les Miserables.
Yeah, that's it. Okay. There's a scene in there where he's what do you call it? Put on a ship, like an orange ship, and then it gets into battle. So you have all these cannons coming through there and all that, and it's very graphic of what we're talking about here as far as the prison. Most of them were chained. Of course, they couldn't get out. Or, water ski, like Ellen says. But it's so good, just the visual, what actually took the filthy conditions. The worst conditions ever.
Before the battle, Don John of Austria did command that all of the chains be let off the oarsmen.
Okay.
So in this battle, maybe not in other battles, but the chain would, be uncomfortable and be in the way, and he wanted everyone to be at maximum effectiveness. And then many of the oarsmen for the Christians were also free men who were armed and gave them just a slight edge over the Ottoman Turks. But thanks for that, Steve. I've seen that movie. I haven't seen it on stage, because that's a musical that's on stage, but on Broadway. But very good.
So did you know if those ships already had the metal rammers on the front of them? Because some of the later sailing ships in the battle, they had metal rammers to smash into the other ship and just sink them right away.
Right, even as late as World War I, dreadnoughts were equipped with solid steel. What is that? The prow, the front of the ship? Mm-hmm. Solid steel prows for ramming. And I think in the Battle of Jutland, which was the only major naval encounter in World War I think some ramming was going on. And famously, John F. Kennedy's PT boat was rammed by a Japanese destroyer, right? But that was an accident. But yeah, people were still ramming each other in the 20th century. But I'm not sure about the rammers on these ships. I'm assuming many of them were like that. But at this time, too, ships were swifter and could evade. And what was more important was having a cannonade and having armed infantrymen with harquebuses and with fire and grappling hooks, to board ships. So there's this wonderful poem by G.K. Chesterton about Lepanto, and it's very famous. He wrote it. When did he write it? He died in 1936. I should know when he wrote it. I think he wrote it right after World War I, or right during World War I, and it was very, very popular in England. And it became a symbol for Christian England during the war with Nazi Germany, World War II, that God would be behind the Christian army, behind the army that was in the right, and would grant them a victory as amazing as the victory at Lepanto. So you're going to get this is my early edition of Chesterton's poems. Let's see, when is this from? This was published in 1936. Oh, the date of his death. And I got it for £2 at a bookstore in Scotland. And when I found it, I was like, you know. Anyways,
mine.
Yeah, mine now. But this is called Lepanto. So just sit back, relax, and you know we don't read poetry very often in Bible class, but I thought a poem would give us a good flavor of the battle. And then I ended a little early, so I'm allowed to do this. All right, Lepanto. White founts falling in the courts of the sun, and the Soldan of Byzantium is smiling as they run. There is laughter like the fountains in that face of all men feared. It stirs the forest darkness, the darkness of his beard. It curls the blood-red crescent, the crescent of his lips. For the inmost sea of all the earth is shaken with his ships. They have dared the white republics up the capes of Italy. They have dashed the Adriatic round the line of the sea. And the Pope has cast his arms abroad for agony and loss, and called the kings of Christendom for swords about the cross. The cold Queen of England is looking in the glass. The shadow of the Valois is yawning at the mass. From evening isles fantastical rings faint the Spanish gun, and the Lord upon the golden horn is laughing in the sun. Dim drums throbbing in the halls half heard, where only on a nameless throne a crownless princess stirred, where, risen from a doubtful seat in half-attained stall, the last knight of Europe takes weapons from the wall. That's John of Austria. The last and lingering troubadour to whom the bird has sung, that once went singing southward when all the world was young. In that enormous silence, tiny and unafraid, comes up along a winding road the noise of the crusade. Strong gongs groaning as the guns boom far. Don John of Austria is going to the war. Stiff flags straining in the night blasts cold, in the gloom black purple, in the glint old gold. Torchlight crimson on the copper kettle drums. Then the tuckets, then the trumpets, then the cannon, and he comes. Don John laughing in the brave beard curled, spurning of his stirrups like the thrones of all the world, holding his head up for a flag of all the free. Love light of Spain, hurrah! Death light of Africa, Don John of Austria is riding to the sea. Mahoned is in his paradise above the evening star. Don John of Austria is going to the war. He moves a mighty turban on the timeless houri's knees, his turban that is woven of the sunset and the seas. He shakes the peacock gardens as he rises from his ease, and he strides among the treetops and is taller than the trees. And his voice through all the garden is a thunder sent to bring black Azrael and Ariel and Ammon on the wing. Giants and the genie, multiplex of wing and eye, whose strong obedience broke the sky when Solomon was king. They rush in red and purple from the red clouds of the morn, from temples where the yellow gods shut up their eyes in scorn. They rise in green roves, roaring from the green hells of the sea, where fallen skies and evil hues and eyeless creatures be. On them the sea valves cluster, and the gray sea forests curl, splashed with the splendid sickness, the sickness of the pearl. They swell in sapphire smoke out of the blue cracks of the ground. They gather and they wonder and give worship to Mahound. And he saith, break up the mountains where the hermit folk may ride, and sift the red and silver sands lest bone of saint abide, and chase the Giaours flying night and day, not giving rest, for that which was our trouble comes again out of the west. We have set the seal of Solomon on all things under sun, of knowledge and of sorrow and endurance of things done. But a noise is in the mountains, and I know the voice that shook our palaces 400 years ago. It is he that saith not Kismet. It is he that knows not fate. It is Richard, it is Raymond, it is Godfrey in the gate. So there he's comparing John of Austria, the admiral, to Richard the Lionheart, to Raymond, and to Godfrey de Bouillon, the leaders of the Crusades against the Muslims. It is he whose loss is laughter when he counts the wager worth. Put down your feet upon him, that our peace be on the earth. For he heard drums groaning, and he heard guns jar. Don John of Austria is going to the war. Sudden and still, hurrah! Bolt from Iberia. Don John of Austria is gone by Alcalar. St. Michael's on his mountain in the sea roads of the north. Don John of Austria is girt and going forth. Where the gray seas glitter and the sharp tides shift, and the sea folk labor and the red sails lift, he shakes his lance of iron and he claps his wings of stone. The noise has gone through Normandy. The noise is gone alone. The north is full of tangled things and texts and aching eyes, and dead is all the innocence of anger and surprise. And Christian killeth Christian in a narrow dusty room, and Christian dreadeth Christ that hath a newer face of doom, and Christian hateth Mary that God kissed in Galilee, but Don John of Austria is riding to the sea. So right there he was blasting Protestants who hate Mary and the Protestants who were killing each other during the European wars of religion. Don John calling through the blast and the eclipse, crying with the trumpet of his lips, trumpet that saith, Ha! Domini Gloria! Don John of Austria is shouting to the ships. King Philip's in his closest with the fleece about his neck. Don John of Austria is armed upon the deck. The walls are hung with velvet that is black and soft as sin, and little dwarfs creep out of it, and little dwarfs creep in. He holds a crystal phial that has colors like the moon. He touches, and it tingles, and he trembles very soon. And his face is as a fungus of a leprous white and gray, like plants in the high houses that are shuttered from the day. And death is in the phial, and the end of noble work. But Don John of Austria has fired upon the Turk. Don John's hunting, and his hounds have bayed. Booms away past Italy the rumor of his raid. Gun upon gun, ha, ha! Gun upon gun, hurrah! Don John of Austria has loosed the cannonade. The Pope was in his chapel before the day or battle broke. Don John of Austria is hidden in the smoke. The hidden room in a man's house where God sits all the year. The secret window whence the world looks small and very dear. He sees as in a mirror on the monstrous twilight sea the crescent of his cruel ships, whose name is Mystery. They fling great shadows forwards, making cross and castle dark. They veil the plumed lions on the galleys of St. Mark. And above the ships are palaces of brown, black-bearded chiefs, and below the ships are prisons where the multitudinous griefs, Christian captives, sick and sunless, all a laboring race repines, like a race in sunken cities, like a nation in the mines. They are lost like slaves that swat, and in the skies of morning hung the stairways of the tallest gods when tyranny was young. They are countless, voiceless, hopeless, as those fallen or fleeing on before the high king's horses in the granite of Babylon. And many a one grows witless in his quiet room in hell, where a yellow face looks inward through the lattice of his cell, and he finds his God forgotten, and he seeks no more a sign. But Don John of Austria has burst the battle line, Don John pounding from the slaughter-painted poop, purpling all the ocean like a bloody pirate sloop, scarlet running over on the silvers and the golds, breaking of the hatches up and bursting of the holds, thronging of the thousands up that labor under sea, white for bliss and blind for sun and stunned for liberty. Vivat Hispania, Domino Gloria, Don John of Austria has set his people free. Cervantes on his galley sets the sword back in the sheath. Don John of Austria rides homeward with a sheath, homeward with a wreath, and he sees across a weary land a straggling road in Spain, up which a lean and foolish knight forever rides in vain. And he smiles, but not his sultan smile, and settles back the blade. Don John of Austria rides home from the crusade. Gilbert K. Chesterton. It'd be cool to memorize that. Maybe one day. All right, everybody, that is the Battle of Lepanto, and you've had a taste now of Chesterton. He was actually an incredibly good poet, as well as journalist and novelist and philosopher and theologian and professor of English at Notre Dame for a semester, and all sorts of other things. He was great. I studied him at University of Glasgow, but that's all today, so go in peace and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God. And I'll see you two ladies up in the conference room for communion. Sounds good.